Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. If you spent any time on this channel, you know the kinds of stories we tell. Men who came here looking for something, a second chance, a fresh start, a bit of warmth after a cold stretch back home, and found that the thing they were looking for came with a price they didn't see on the label. We've had lorry drivers and teachers, ex-soldiers and accountants. We've had men who lost thousands, and men who lost more than that. We don't dress these stories up. We don't add happy endings that weren't there. But this one is a bit different, and I want to tell you why before I hand you over. The man you're about to hear from is named Declan Murtagh. He's 54 years old, he's from Limerick in Ireland, and he spent 26 years as a Garda officer. That's the Irish police. Nearly 3 decades reading people for a living. Interviewing suspects, spotting inconsistencies, building cases from details that most people would walk straight past. That was his profession, and by all accounts, he was good at it. I'm telling you that up front because it matters. Because what happened to Declan in Vietnam didn't happen to a naive man. It didn't happen to someone who hadn't heard the warnings. And it didn't happen because he was reckless or foolish or desperate in any obvious way. It happened anyway. I'll let him tell you how. This is his story, in his own words. Right, so I'll start where I always started with the job. Because you can't understand the rest of it without understanding what 26 years in the Garda does to a person. Specifically what it did to me. I joined at 22. Spent most of my career in Limerick, not the tourist brochure version of Limerick. Not the King John's Castle and the Treaty Stone and the nice restaurants down by the river. The real one. The one with the same families cycling through the same situations year after year. The same arguments that started over nothing and ended in somebody going to hospital. You learn things in that job. Practical things about human behavior. People lie in patterns. They lie in ways that are shaped by what they're afraid of. And when you've sat across a table from enough of them, you start to develop what I can only describe as a sense for it. A kind of internal register that flags when something doesn't sit right, when the explanation is slightly too neat, when the eyes are doing something, the words aren't. I was proud of that. I won't pretend I wasn't. It was the one thing I felt genuinely competent at, and after 26 years, it had become more or less indistinguishable from who I was. The problem with that, and I understand this clearly now, though I didn't then, is that confidence in your own judgment is only useful up to the point where it stops you questioning your own judgment. After that, it becomes something else entirely. After that, it becomes a liability. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My wife Siobhan left me in the autumn, 3 years ago. I came home on a Thursday evening. I'd been covering a late shift, nothing dramatic, a noise complaint out in Castle Troy that turned out to be a 17th birthday party, and there was a letter on the kitchen table. Sealed envelope, my name on the front in her handwriting. I stood there for a moment looking at it. I knew before I opened it, which, if I'm honest, is its own kind of information about the state of the marriage, but that's a separate conversation. 19 years. 2 daughters, Aoife, who's 22 at the time, and Neve, 20. The house in Dorodoyle, which I'd spent 4 years renovating in whatever hours the job left over, went in the settlement. Fair enough, in legal terms. Not something I had much appetite to argue about, if I'm truthful. The man she left for was called Darren. He sold insurance and, from what I could gather, spent a considerable amount of time in the gym. I've nothing particular to say about Darren. He's not relevant to this story. What is relevant is that I didn't see it coming. And I want to be precise about why that matters. Because it would have been easy to tell myself that nobody sees these things coming, that marriages end and it's always a surprise to somebody. But I was a man who read people for a living. I had spent my entire professional life noticing things, and I had failed to notice this in my own house, for if I'm being honest about the timeline, probably 2 years. I filed that away. I didn't know where to file it exactly, so I just put it somewhere I didn't have to look at it directly, and I got on with things. I applied for early retirement at 53. The Garda has provisions for it, and the timing worked, and the truth, which I didn't say to anyone at the time, is that the job had been hollowing out for years. I'd stayed because leaving felt like admitting something. When the marriage ended, that particular reason for staying ended with it. So I filled in the forms, I did the handover, I went out for drinks with the lads from the station, I was given a card and a bottle of Redbreast, and that was 26 years. Then it was just me, in a rented flat in the city center, with a Garda pension paying in every month, and nowhere in particular to be. I want to be careful not to over-dramatize this next part, because it sounds worse than it was. Or maybe it was exactly as bad as it sounds, and I just don't want to admit that. but there were a few months there that were quiet, in a way that had a weight to it. Aoife and Neve were civil. Aoife rang on my birthday. Neve sent a message. I understood it. When a marriage ends, the children are not obliged to take equal portions of both parents' version of things, and I suspect my version was not the one that invited the most sympathy. I didn't push it. I watched a lot of television. I took long walks along the Shannon that I told myself were for my health. I ate too many microwave meals, and I drank a normal amount of Jameson by Irish standards, which is a sliding scale, but it wasn't alarming. I slept badly. Most nights I was awake by 2, 3 in the morning, and I'd end up on my phone or on the laptop, watching things I can't even remember now. That's how I found the Vietnam videos. Some channel I couldn't even tell you which one now, with drone footage of Hue An at dusk, the lanterns over the river, women on bicycles in white ao dai, streets that were dense and warm, and looked absolutely nothing like anywhere I'd ever walked. I watched for 4 hours that first night. I watched more the following night. Within a week, I was in Facebook groups for expats in Da Nang. Within 3 weeks, I was reading about long-stay visas and monthly costs, and which neighborhoods were recommended for older Western lads who weren't there on a party holiday. I told myself it was just curiosity. I told myself I was just doing research, the way you do when something catches your attention and you want to understand it. I told myself, when I booked the flight 6 weeks later, that it was just a holiday. A man my age was entitled to a holiday. There was nothing unusual about it. I told myself a lot of things in those months. I was very busy telling myself things. Looking back now, I understand that the telling and the believing are two different operations, and I had largely stopped doing the second one without noticing. I booked a return ticket that part 1 want to be clear about. Return ticket. 4 weeks. Just to see. I packed a backpack rather than a suitcase, which I also want to note, because it seemed to matter at the time. A suitcase felt like a statement. A backpack was just a man going to have a look around. I flew out in February. I landed at Da Nang International at 6:30 in the morning, local time. The flight from Dublin had gone via Doha, 14 hours in total, and I was stiff in the shoulder from sleeping at a bad angle against the window. I came through arrivals into a wall of warm air and noise, and the particular chaos of a Vietnamese airport at rush-hour motorbikes visible through the glass doors. A man holding a sign with a name that wasn't mine, 2 small children eating something from a plastic bag. I stood there for a moment, backpack on, and had the very clear thought that I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. That feeling lasted about 48 hours. Then something else replaced it, and that something else is a large part of why when telling this story. The guest house was on a small street off Truong Pho, a 10-minute walk from the Han River. The owner was a compact, energetic man in his 50s named Min, who spoke functional English and had an opinion about everything, delivered whether you'd asked for it or not. He showed me to a room on the 2nd floor, clean, tiled, a ceiling fan, a window overlooking a laneway where someone was already frying something that smelled extraordinary at 6 in the morning. It cost 450,000 dong a night, which I had to do the maths on 3 times before I stopped feeling like I was being robbed and started feeling like I was being given something. The first morning I walked to the nearest place that looked like it served food and pointed at something on the menu. What arrived was a bowl of bumbu, spicy beef noodle soup, I know now, with a pork hock and a thick red broth that I can only describe as a significant experience for a man accustomed to porridge. I ate the whole thing, sweating, and ordered a café soir, the iced coffee, with condensed milk that I would subsequently drink every morning for the next 18 months of my life at various points across the city. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I was, without quite having planned it, extremely happy. I want to pause on that, because it's important. That happiness was real. I'm not telling a story about a man who was miserable from start to finish. The first days in Da Nang were genuinely good. The heat, the noise, the colors, the food, the motorbikes going past in streams so constant they became a kind of white noise. None of it looked like Limerick. None of it required me to be the man I'd been in Limerick. I walked along the Han River in the evenings and watched the bridges change color. And I was, for the first time in longer than I could honestly account for, not thinking about the house in Dora Doyle, or the letter on the kitchen table, or the particular silence of a Tuesday evening with nowhere to be. Nobody knew me here. That was the thing. I was just a tall, quiet Irish fellow with a backpack, and that was apparently a perfectly sufficient identity. The guest house had 2 other long-term guests. a retired English teacher from Leeds named Gordon, who had been in Da Nang for 3 years and had the calm, slightly glazed quality of a man who had resolved most of his problems by the simple expedient of not going home, and a younger Australian fellow, W, mid-30s, who was teaching English somewhere in the city and kept unusual hours. I ate breakfast with Gordon twice. He was pleasant, uneventful company. On the second morning he told me, without any particular emphasis, to be careful. I said I would be. We both understood that I hadn't really registered what he meant, and neither of us followed up on it. I spent the first week walking. That's the honest account of it. I walked for hours each day along the beach at Machi, where the sand was white and the water was warm, and where I waded in up to my knees in my clothes on the fourth day, because I hadn't brought swimwear and couldn't find a compelling reason not to. I took a day trip down to Hoi An on the back of Axioma motorbike taxi, having understood from the Facebook groups that this was the proper way to do it, and I spent 4 hours in the old town walking through lantern light and eating banh hai mi and feeling the particular mild vertigo of being were so visually unlike anything in your experience that your brain keeps doing small double takes. I liked it. I liked it genuinely and without complication. I was sightseeing. I was a tourist on holiday. There was nothing wrong with any of it. I'd also, by the end of the first week, begun to get a sense of the expat world that existed alongside the tourist one. And I want to be honest about my reaction to it because it matters for the rest of the story. The men I was encountering in the cafes and along the river, mostly Western, mostly a certain age, mostly alone or in pairs. Some of them were clearly in straightforward situations. English teachers, remote workers, people who had simply decided they preferred the cost and the warmth of Southeast Asia to whatever they'd left behind. But others had a quality I recognized from the job, a certain looseness, a certain willingness to be wherever the current took them, and a number of them were with Vietnamese women in ways that looked, to my professional eye, worth asking questions about. I told myself, very clearly, that I was not here for that. I had watched enough YouTube by that point to know the shape of the thing. I was a 54-year-old retired Garda officer with a functioning pension and a reasonably intact brain. I was not going to be one of those lads. I want you to hold that thought, because I'm going to be coming back to it. Day 9. The heat had come up particularly hard by mid-morning, and I'd been walking since 8. I was near the Han River Market. I'd been looking for a specific type of dried fruit I'd seen in one of Gordon's care packages from home, and had gotten turned around in the lanes, and I ducked into a coffee shop, more or less at random. It was the kind of place that existed in small pockets all over this city. Tiled floors, slow fans, plastic stools, condensation rings on every surface, and the smell of coffee strong enough to justify crossing an ocean for. I ordered, found a corner, and sat down. She was at a table near the window, reading something, a paperback, Vietnamese, held flat open with one hand while the other turned a glass of iced tea slowly on the table. Small, neatly dressed, somewhere in her early 30s. She had the kind of stillness that some people carry naturally, the kind that makes a room quieter around them. I want to be precise about this moment because I've thought about it a great deal since. I did not think, this is a woman who is going to take $29,000 from me over the next 18 months. I thought, she seems like interesting company. And I've spoken to no one today except a man selling pineapple who is understandably not interested in a long conversation. I sat there for 10 minutes. Then I picked up my coffee and walked over and said something like, I'm sorry to interrupt. I notice you're reading and I won't be long. But I'm Irish, and I've been here 9 days, and you're the first person I've genuinely wanted to talk to. Would you mind if I sat for a moment? She looked up. She tilted her head slightly, the way some people do when they're genuinely considering something rather than performing consideration. And she said, in careful, measured English, all right, but I have to leave at 12. It was 11:20. Her name was Lynn. She was 31. She taught primary school in a district outside the city, she said, which explained why she was in town that morning. A curriculum meeting, now finished, a coffee before the journey back. She was polite, unhurried, and asked me more questions than she answered. When I mentioned I was a retired police officer, she nodded as though that was a reasonable thing to be, which is not the universal response in my experience. She did not ask what I was doing in Vietnam, or how long I was staying, or whether I was married. At 11:58, she closed her book, put it in her bag, and said she had to go. She thanked me for the conversation. I asked if I could message her, at some point, if she was agreeable to it. She paused, a real pause, not performed, or what I took to be a real pause, and said yes, and gave me her number. I walked back to the guest house in the heat and sat on the edge of my bed and thought about absolutely nothing for a while. Then I thought about the return ticket I had booked for 3 weeks' time, and I thought, there's probably no harm in extending that slightly. That was day 9. That was where it started. And I want to be clear, already lying to myself about why. I messaged her that evening. Something brief. I said I'd enjoyed the conversation and that if she was ever in the city again and had 40 minutes to spare, I'd be glad to buy her a coffee in return for the one she'd bought herself. I kept it light, tried not to sound like what I was, which was a recently retired, recently divorced, 54-year-old Irishman who had spent the previous 40 minutes in his guesthouse room composing and deleting versions of the same message. She replied the following morning. Short, friendly, no particular encouragement. She said she'd let me know next time she was in Da Nang. That was a Thursday. I didn't hear from her again until the following Tuesday, when she said she'd be in the city on Friday and could meet at 11 if that suited. It suited. I confirmed immediately, then spent 30 seconds regretting how immediately I'd confirmed. She canceled Friday afternoon. Something with a student's family. She said a situation that had come up and needed her to be present. She apologized. She suggested the following Wednesday. I said that was fine. She canceled Wednesday as well. A school inspection, she said. Very short notice. Very sorry. I want to be honest about what I did with those 2 cancellations. I did not think, this is a woman who is deliberately creating scarcity to increase my investment. I thought, this is a woman with a real job and real responsibilities who doesn't rearrange her life around a man she met in a coffee shop a week ago. And I found that I want to be precise here. I found that genuinely attractive. Every other interaction I'd had with women in this city, such as it was, had a certain quality of availability to it that made me uncomfortable. Lynn was not available. She had a schedule. She had priorities that preceded me. That seemed healthy. That seemed like evidence of character. Looking back now, I understand that I was doing the job myself. She didn't have to sell me on the idea that she was different from the stories I'd heard. She simply behaved in ways that allowed me to sell myself on it. There's a difference, and it matters, and I missed it completely. We finally met on a Thursday, 11 days after the coffee shop. A small place on Ladouan, she suggested, quieter than the river cafes, good coffee, no tourists. She was already there when I arrived, which I noted. In my experience, people who are working an angle tend to let you arrive first. She was not working an angle, as far as I could determine. She was a primary school teacher with the Tuesday curriculum meeting and a genuine interest in whether Ireland was as cold as she'd read it was. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about my daughters by name. I'd mentioned them briefly in the coffee shop, and she listened properly when I answered, the way that some people do where you can tell they're actually building a picture rather than just waiting for their turn. She talked about her students with a specificity that would have been strange to manufacture. The boy in her class who couldn't sit still and turned out to have a hearing problem nobody had identified. The girl who drew horses on everything and wanted to be a veterinarian. The general state of Riso, RC's in a school that served a community that didn't have much. She mentioned, in passing, that one child didn't have the right textbooks and the school couldn't cover the gap. She mentioned it once as context for something else and moved on. I filed that. I didn't do anything with it that day, but I'd filed it. Over the following 2 weeks, we met 4 more times. The pattern was, she was always slightly harder to arrange than the previous occasions suggested, always present and engaged when we actually met, and never once asked me about money, about my pension, about what I owned or owed or intended to do with the rest of my life. She paid her share of the first 2 coffees, briskly, before I could reach for my wallet. I insisted on the third. She accepted without making a performance of it either way. She showed me photographs of her classroom on her phone one afternoon. A whiteboard, small wooden desks, a wall display of children's drawings, a window overlooking a courtyard. The photographs looked exactly like a primary school classroom. I know now that they could have come from anywhere. At the time, they looked like evidence. After the 3rd week, I booked day trips. And first, which she knew well, and talked about with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up nearby, pointing out things I'd have walked past, the particular architecture of a merchant family's house, the way the different cultural influences had layered over each other in the streets. Then Masun, the old Sham temple ruins an hour inland, where we walked in the heat through red stone, and she told me what she knew about the history of the people who'd built it in a measured, knowledgeable way that I found, as with most things she did, convincing in a manner that was difficult to, interrogate. A weekend in Light, the hill town in the highlands, where the temperature dropped enough that she wore a jacket, and we ate hot pot in a restaurant full of Vietnamese families and watched the fog come in off the pine trees outside. I paid for all of it. Every meal, every guest house, every exiome, every entrance fee. I want to account for that. Across those 5 weeks, the trips and the meals and the coffees and incidentals came to roughly $2,800. I'm giving you that figure not because it was alarming. It wasn't, for what it was, which was a month of travel with another person in a country where things cost very little by Western standards, but because it was the first stage of a system I didn't know I was inside. At the time, it felt like what it looked like: a man with money, a woman without much of it, dating in a country where the economic gap between them was simply a fact of the situation. I felt generous. I felt like someone providing, which is a feeling I'd apparently been missing more than I'd understood. The textbook money. I want to come back to that because even now, it's the part one return to most. About 3 weeks in, Lynn mentioned the student again, the one without the textbooks. She wasn't asking for anything. She was explaining that she'd decided to buy them herself, out of her own salary, but that it would be tight that month. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, not as a prelude to anything. I said, "How much would it cost for the books?" She said it wasn't my concern. I said, "I know it isn't, but how much?" She gave me the figure 4 million dong, roughly $160, and said again that it wasn't necessary. I sent her the money that evening by bank transfer. She thanked me. Her exact words were, "This is very kind, Declan, but please don't do this again." She said it as though she meant it. I found this, I am not ashamed to say, extremely affecting. She had just told me not to give her money. Every alarm bell I'd been told to listen for was pointing the wrong direction. I understand now what that was. It was a calibration. She was taking a measurement of how I responded to need specifically, whether I responded to it eagerly, whether I needed to be the solution, whether I could be led to act against my own stated interest by appealing to something that felt like generosity rather than transaction. She got what she needed to know, and she did it for $160, which in the context of what followed was extremely good value. I extended my stay by 3 weeks. I told myself it was Vietnam. Generally the food, the weather, the rhythm of the place, and that was not entirely untrue, but it also wasn't the main reason, and I knew it. I booked the extension on a Sunday evening while Lynn was in Quang Nam province and not available to meet, and I felt, doing it, a combination of sheepishness and relief that I hadn't felt in years. 6 weeks after arriving, I flew back to Limerick. I had to. My visa was due, I had practical things to deal with, and there was a small voice somewhere in me that said it was worth going home to establish that I still had one. The 6 weeks in Limerick were the longest 6 weeks I can remember since leaving the force. The flat was the same. The river was the same. The microwave meals were the same. Awefe rang once to check in, which I appreciated. I said everything was fine. I didn't mention Lynn, which was not exactly a lie but was not, either, the complete truth. The evenings were long, and the time zones meant that messaging Lynn was easiest in the mornings, and I found myself structuring my days around those morning exchanges in a way that I noticed but declined to examine. I booked the second flight on a Tuesday afternoon. Return ticket again. I told myself that too, which, by this point, was a habit of self-reassurance that had almost entirely decoupled from the actual question of whether I was going to use it. I packed a suitcase. I didn't think about that, particularly. A suitcase was just more practical for a longer visit. There was nothing significant about it. I landed in Da Nang on a Thursday morning in late spring, and the heat came through the arrival's doors, and the coffee was already waiting at a place I already knew, and it already felt, in a way that should probably have alarmed me more than it did, like coming back to somewhere I lived. Something had shifted in the 6 weeks I'd been gone. It was subtle. Lynn was not a person who did anything dramatically, but it was there. She met me at the cafe rather than waiting for me to suggest it. She held my hand walking back along the river that first evening, briefly, naturally, as though it were a thing we'd always done. When we talked about the following week, she suggested places rather than waiting for me to plan them. It had the quality of a relationship settling into something established. After 6 weeks of microwave meals in Limerick, thinking about it from 10,000 kilometers away, it felt, and I want to be precise about this, it felt like arriving at something rather than pursuing it. We spent the first weeks of that second visit in a comfortable, domestic pattern. I had a preferred cafe by this point, a narrow place on Nguyen Chi Tan, with a balcony over the street where the owner knew my order and had stopped pretending to present me with a menu. I had a preferred route along the river in the evenings. I was learning Vietnamese slowly, badly, 20 words that I deployed with enough confidence that people were consistently kind about it. Lynn found this quietly amusing. She corrected my pronunciation without making a performance of it, which is a particular form of intimacy I hadn't expected to miss. About 3 weeks into the second visit, she asked if I would like to meet her mother. I said I would. The village was an hour's drive outside Hien, down roads that got progressively narrower and quieter, until we were moving between rice paddies, with motorbikes appearing from side lanes with no warning. Lynn's mother lived in a house that was modest and clean, a front room with a small altar, incense in a ceramic holder, family photographs on a shelf, including one of Lynn as a child in a school uniform with her hair in plaits, a rear room, a kitchen with a gas burner and a pot of something that smelled of ginger and star anise. The mother came out to meet us from the back of the house. She was small and warm and moved with a particular care, the way that people do when something hurts and they have decided not to say so. She spoke no English. Lynn translated. What the mother said, or what Lynn told me she said, was that she was glad to meet me, that Lynn had spoken well of me, and that Ireland must be very beautiful and very cold. She brought tea. She brought fruit-sliced mango on a plate, some small sticky cakes wrapped in banana leaf. She sat with us for an hour and asked, through Lynn, about my daughters, about whether I missed home, about what Irish food was like. She laughed when I described attempting to explain Limerick to someone with no reference point. I want to be honest about what that afternoon felt like, because it's tempting to say I should have known better and leave it at that. It felt like being welcomed into a family. That is what it felt like. An old woman in a tidy house making tea and asking about my daughters with what appeared to be genuine interest. I sat in that room, and I felt, without quite being able to name it at the time, something I hadn't felt since the house in Dooradoyle, like I belonged somewhere. I understand now that this is exactly what it was designed to feel like. But I didn't know it was designed. On the drive back to Da Nang, the sun going down over the paddy fields in a way that was almost unreasonably beautiful, Lynn mentioned her mother's stomach. A recurring problem, she said, that had been coming and going for a year or more. There was medication that helped, but it was expensive relative to what the family had, and sometimes they managed it, and sometimes they couldn't. She said this in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for most things, not as a request, as a context. She was not asking me for anything. I asked how much the medication cost. She said it was not my concern. I'm going to pause here and invite you to notice that this was the exact same sequence as the textbook money. The same words, even not my concern. She had used this construction before. I had found it moving the first time. It had not occurred to me that I might be hearing it a second time by design. I offered to help with the medication costs. She hesitated. She was very consistent about the hesitation and said it wasn't necessary. I said I wanted to. She accepted, with a quietness that felt like dignity rather than strategy. The amount was $400, transferred to her the following morning. Now I need to give you the full sequence of this, because laying it out is the only way it makes sense. I'm going to tell it to you the way I eventually reconstructed it, like a case summary, because that's the only register in which I can be honest about what happened without excusing it. Month 5, $400 for medication. Month 7, $800 when the condition worsened and a doctor visit was needed. Month 8, $1,200 when Lynn mentioned a specialist consultation in Da Nang was being recommended. At each stage, a plausible amount. A reluctant ask. Genuine seeming gratitude. Nothing that looked, by itself, like a pattern. Total across those months, $2,400. If you had shown me those three figures on a spreadsheet, I would have seen it immediately. I would have been across the table from someone, and I would have had it identified inside a minute. The consistency of the request and reluctance cycle, the escalating amounts, the way each payment opened the door just enough to make the next one feel like a natural continuation. 26 years. I would have had it in 60 seconds. But it didn't come as a spreadsheet. It came in a car driving home from an old woman's house at sunset, while the woman I was in a relationship with mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her mother's health was a source of ongoing difficulty. That is the distance between the theoretical and the practical. That is the gap I fell through. Between the second and third visits, I flew home again. My savings at this point were in the region of $57,000 dented, but not alarming, not enough to require re-examining anything. Back in Limerick, I met my retired colleague Sion for a pint one evening, and mentioned Lynn in the same vague, careful terms I'd been using with everyone. Woman I'd met in Vietnam, teacher, and seeing each other across visits seemed serious. Cian's response was immediate and positive. He knew a fella, he said, married a Vietnamese woman a decade ago. Lovely family, very traditional, no nonsense about it. He said it with the easy confidence of someone passing along secondhand reassurance, not realizing that was precisely what I needed it to be. I thanked him. I felt confirmed. I didn't examine why I had needed confirming. That would have required me to ask what I was worried about, and I wasn't prepared to ask that yet. The third visit had a different quality from the first two. I had a preferred cafe, a preferred route, a smattering of Vietnamese phrases that made shopkeepers smile. I had Lynn, who by this point was spending 2 or 3 evenings a week with me, cooking sometimes in the guest house's small kitchen, teaching me to make a passable bowl of singtemtem. We talked about the future in the way that couples do when neither of them is quite ready to make it specific. Loose references to what it would be like if she came to Ireland, how different the cold would feel, whether she would find Limerick strange. It was future-facing without being a plan. That suited me. Planning felt like pressure. This felt like possibility. That was when I saw the second phone. She was replying to a message on a phone I hadn't seen before, a different model from the one I knew. I asked, and she explained. It was a school phone, issued to class teachers for communication with parents. Some of the parents used it after hours for updates about their children. She found it annoying, but it came with the role. She put it in her bag. I accepted this without any particular difficulty. Looking back now, I can identify that moment, precisely the first moment where something didn't fit, and I chose, consciously and quickly, not to pull on it. I know why I didn't. I know exactly why. Because I was sitting in a city I'd come to love, in a relationship that had become the organizing principle of my daily life, and the alternative to accepting the explanation was to begin a process I wasn't ready for. I flew back to Ireland and booked the fourth visit. And during that gap between visits, an evening in Limerick with the rain coming sideways off the Shannon, Lynn sent me a message that I read 3 times. Her exact words were, "Declan, I am thinking about us and about the future. Do you think about marriage?" She had framed it as a question, not a suggestion. A question. I sat with that for a long time. Then I typed back, "I think about it, yes." I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because there's a version of it that makes me sound like a man who didn't know what he was doing, and that's not quite right. The more accurate version is that I knew, in a general way, that I was moving quickly. I knew 14 months was not a long time. I knew that 14 months spread across 4 visits, with gaps in between of 6 and 8 weeks, probably amounted to something closer to 5 or 6 months of actual shared time. I had done that arithmetic. I had sat with it honestly, at least once, and then I proposed anyway. The decision accumulated rather than arrived. That's the only way I can describe it. By the 4th visit, the relationship had a weight to it that made the question feel less like a leap and more like the next logical step on a path I was already well along. We had talked about Ireland. We had talked about her coming there. We had talked, in the careful, indirect way of 2 people who were each waiting for the other to make it concrete, about a future that was beginning to have specific geography. At some point during those conversations, the question stopped being if and started being when, and then started being how. And once you're at how, the rest follows with a kind of inevitability that feels, at the time, like clarity. I rang Cian from my guest house one evening, the fan going overhead, the street noise coming up through the window. I told him I was thinking about asking Lynn to marry me. He said he thought that was fine, that it sounded like I'd thought it through. He mentioned his friend again, the one with the Vietnamese wife, lovely family. I thanked him and hung up and sat in the heat for a while and decided that yes, I had thought it through and I was going to do it. The dinner was at a restaurant on Viet Street, along the river. Not the most expensive place in the city. I'd asked Lynn once what she thought of people who needed everything to be impressive, and she had said she found it a bit sad, which I had filed as evidence of her character rather than information about my budget. The food was good. The lights on the water were on. I asked her. She was quiet for a moment. A pause I read, at the time, as being moved, and then she said yes. I bought a ring the following week from a jeweler near the market, $340. I had asked Lynn beforehand what she thought was appropriate, and she had said, "Declan, it doesn't matter, it's just a symbol." I found this touching. I want to note that I found this touching, because the alternative interpretation that she was not particularly invested in the ring, because the ring was not the transaction, did not occur to me. Within a fortnight of the engagement, Lynn mentioned a visa agent. A colleague of hers, she said, had been through the same process. A Vietnamese woman wanting to join a foreign partner in Europe and had used someone who knew the paperwork well. She could introduce us if that would help. I said that would be helpful. The agent had an office in the He Shao district, a proper room with a desk and a printer and framed certificates on the wall. Her English was precise and professional. She laid out the process clearly, translated and certified documents, sponsor letter, relationship verification materials, processing fees at various stages. She gave me a fee schedule. Everything was itemized. I reviewed it the way I'd reviewed paperwork for 26 years. Methodically, checking the figures were internally consistent, checking the headings were logical. What I did not do was verify whether the process itself was real. I checked the documents I was given. I did not think to question whether the framework those documents existed within was legitimate. That is the distinction I missed. I was reviewing the internal consistency of a fiction without asking whether the fiction was true. Over the following 4 months, I paid the agent a total of $5,500 across 6 payments. Each payment corresponded to a stage in the process document: preparation, submission fee, review period, certification, what she called a relationship verification assessment, and a final administrative processing charge. I have since spoken to people with experience in legitimate Irish immigration processing. The relationship verification fee does not exist. The final administrative processing charge does not exist. Certain other elements of the schedule were real costs, substantially inflated. At the time, 6 payments across 4 months felt like a process. It felt like bureaucracy, which I understood. Bureaucracy moves in stages. You pay at each stage. I had spent my career navigating state paperwork. This felt familiar. That was precisely why it worked. The other costs ran alongside the visa process. Lynn's mother was admitted to a hospital in Da Nang in month 14. A specific ward, a private room, a photograph of a hospital corridor that Lynn sent me at 11 at night with a message saying she was sorry to worry me, but things had gotten worse. $3,200. I transferred it the following morning. The hospital was real. I looked it up. I verified its address. I am fairly confident now that the photograph was taken at a different time for a different purpose. But the hospital was real. That is the thing about how this was constructed. The lies were always anchored to real things. You could check the real thing and find it exactly where she said it was, and that would satisfy the part of your brain that was checking. The motorbike. She mentioned that the school commute had become difficult. The district was further than it had been, some reorganization of classes, and that a motorbike of her own would make it manageable rather than dependent on relatives. She had found a second-hand one. 17 million dong, approximately $1,800. She was not asking me for it, she said. She was just mentioning it because she'd been thinking about it. I said, show me the shop. She showed me the shop. We went together. I saw the bike. It was a Honda Wave, red, 2 years old, in decent condition. I paid. The bike existed. I watched her ride it out of the forecourt. I felt, I will admit, the particular satisfaction of a man who has solved the problem. The land deposit was the largest single amount, and also, looking back, the most straightforwardly strange. In month 16, Lynn mentioned that her family had an opportunity to purchase a small plot of land near the village agricultural land. Modest, but an investment that would give her mother security. The family could cover most of it, but were short of a deposit. Once Lynn was in Ireland and we were settled, she said, it would become a shared asset, something to our joint benefit. She said her exact words were, I want you to feel that you are already part of this family. $3,500. A document was produced. A plot was shown to me on a Saturday morning. A field between 2 other fields. A corner post with a faded number on it. I signed the document. I took a photograph of the plot on my phone. The document is, I now understand, worthless. But I took the photograph, and the field was real, and the corner post was real. And I stood in the morning heat with the smell of the earth around me and felt like a man who was building something. My savings at this point were below $40,000. Willem was a Dutchman, 42, had been in Da Nang for 7 years, worked remotely in something to do with logistics software. I got to know him at the cafe on Nguyen Chi Thun over several months. The kind of friendship that accumulates through shared geography rather than intention, which is most of the good friendships I've had. He was direct in the way that Dutch people are direct, which I respected because it was efficient. One evening, over coffee, I mentioned the visa process in passing, the total costs, the timeline, the number of payments. He put his cup down. He said the figure I'd described for legitimate visa processing from Vietnam to Ireland should be, at most, around 800 to 1,000 euros for everything, including certified translations. He said this without drama, the way he said most things. He asked me the name of the agent. I told him it wasn't a concern, that she'd been recommended and seemed professional and knew the process well. He said, all right. He said he hoped he was wrong. He picked up his cup again. I thanked him and moved the conversation elsewhere. I did this deliberately and quickly. The way you redirect a conversation when it's heading somewhere you've already decided you don't want to go. I am not proud of that. But I want to be honest, I knew, at some level, when Willem said it, that the number was wrong. I had not known before he said it. After he said it, I knew. And I moved the conversation anyway. There was an evening around month 16 when I tried to look up Lynn's school online, not out of suspicion, just idle curiosity. I wanted to see a photograph of the building. The searches came back with several schools in the district, but none matching the name she'd given me precisely. I told myself the romanization was inconsistent, that Vietnamese place names translated into English with variations, that the school might use a slightly different official name from its colloquial one. I told myself this fluently and convincingly, the way you tell yourself things when you've had practice. Then there were the 2 weeks in month 16 when Lynn was cold. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded confrontation, just clipped in her messages, slightly unavailable, briefly unkind, in a way that seemed out of character. When I asked if something was wrong, she said she was stressed about her mother. She apologized after a fortnight. She was warm again. Things returned to what they'd been. I now believe those 2 weeks corresponded with her managing another person's timeline simultaneously, and that whatever that situation required had temporarily taken her attention. At the time, I accepted the explanation because it was the only one I had the appetite for. The second phone appeared more often during that period. She used it openly, briefly, put it away. I noted it every time and said nothing every time. I was very good, by this point, at filing things I didn't want to examine. It was a skill I had developed over 18 months with considerable dedication. There was one evening, near the end of that fourth visit, when I asked Lynn about her school's district. I was trying to describe to Willem roughly where in the province she taught, and I wanted to get the geography right. She gave me a slightly different answer from the one she'd given me before. Not dramatically different, a different sub-district, or a different way of referring to the same area. I noticed the discrepancy, and I said, I thought you said it was in a different district before. She said the district boundaries had been redrawn recently, that what had been one district was now split into 2 administrative areas, and people were still getting used to the new names. She said it without hesitation. I said, right, and I let it go. Looking back now, that moment is the clearest one. Not because the explanation was obviously wrong. It wasn't. It was plausible. But because of what I felt when she gave it. I felt relief. I wasn't looking for the truth. I was looking for a reason not to look for the truth. She gave me one, and I took it immediately, and we talked about something else. Lynn's birthday was coming up in a few weeks. I wanted to do something that would actually surprise her. She was not easy to surprise. She noticed things, and I thought, flowers, sent to her school, the classroom she'd described, in front of her students. Something she couldn't anticipate because it would arrive when she wasn't with me. I asked Huang, who owned the cafe on Nguyen Chi Ton and knew most of what was knowable about the neighborhoods on this side of the city. I gave her the school name and the district. I said I wanted to send flowers to a teacher there for her birthday. I asked if she knew anyone with contacts in that area who could help me find the address. Hyang said she'd asked around and let me know. That was a Tuesday afternoon. I drank my coffee, said goodbye, walked back along the river in the early evening heat, and felt, without any particular premonition, like a man who had finally figured out how to do something right. He Chuang came back to me on a Thursday morning, 2 days after I'd asked her. I was at my usual table on the balcony, second coffee, watching the street below, and she came out from behind the counter with a cloth in her hand and a look I didn't immediately know how to read. She sat down across from me, which she didn't normally do. She said she'd asked around. She had a cousin who taught in Quang Nam province and knew the school system in that district reasonably well. She'd given her cousin the school name and the teacher's description. Her cousin had made some inquiries. There was no teacher matching that description at the school I'd named. Her cousin had also checked with contacts at 2 other nearby schools, as the name could have corresponded to either. No teacher named Lynn at any of them, not currently and not in recent memory. Hing was apologetic about delivering this. She said she was sure there was a simple explanation, that the district was large, that maybe the name of the school had been slightly wrong. She said this to be kind, and I appreciated it, and I thanked her and said I'd look into it, and she went back behind the counter, and I sat on the balcony with my coffee going warm in the heat and did not move for some time. I want to describe the next 24 hours carefully, because they were the strangest of the whole experience, and I don't think I've fully understood them until recently. I went back to the guest house. I sat in the room with the ceiling fan going and the street noise coming up from below, and I did not message Lynn, and I did not call her, and I did not do anything for the rest of that day. I ordered food from somewhere nearby and ate it without tasting it, and went to bed at 9 and lay in the dark with the fan moving the air overhead, and thought about everything and nothing simultaneously for several hours. Part of me knew, that is what I want to be honest about. Not a small part, a substantial part. A part that had probably known for some time and had been filing and redirecting and accepting convenient explanations while the knowing accumulated quietly in a corner I had been professionally avoiding. When Hing sat down across from me with the cloth in her hand and the careful look, something settled into place that had been unsettled for a while. I felt it go. But knowing and letting yourself know are two different operations, and I had become expert at maintaining the gap between them. So I lay in the dark and gave myself one more day, not to investigate to grieve the thing I already understood was true, before I made it official. The following morning, I walked to the Café Non. Non's a different one, further along the river. I sat for an hour, and I thought, with the clarity that comes after a night of not sleeping, about everything in sequence. The school name that hadn't resolved online. The school phone with its convenient explanation. The 2 cold weeks, and the second phone appearing more often. Willem and his cup going down and the number that was wrong. The district that had been recently redrawn. Every item I had filed went into a single pile, and I looked at the pile and I understood what it was. Then I rang Willem. He answered on the second ring. I told him what Shung had found. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I hoped I was wrong, Declan." He said it without any quality of satisfaction in it, which I appreciated more than I was able to express at the time. He said he knew someone, a local man, reliable, who did this sort of work quietly and charged a flat fee. He gave me the number. I texted the investigator that afternoon. We met the following morning at a cafe in the An district, across the Han River. He was a compact, middle-aged Vietnamese man, matter-of-fact and efficient. He said, "Give me 5 days, $300, cash." I gave him both. The 5 days were among the strangest I've spent anywhere. I saw Lynn twice during that period. I behaved, as far as I was able to manage, exactly as I had before. I had spent 26 years conducting myself in the presence of people, while knowing things about their circumstances that they didn't know I knew. That professional training turned out to have one final use. On the 5th day, the investigator delivered his report by WhatsApp. A voice note of about 8 minutes, followed by a folder of photographs. I listened to the voice note sitting on the edge of my bed, with the fan overhead and the notebook I'd been using for visa paperwork open on the desk beside me. Lynn was not a teacher. She had not worked as a teacher for at least 3 years, and possibly longer. She lived in an apartment in the Sun Tra district, the peninsula on the north side of the city, across the river, with a Vietnamese man in his late 30s. The visa agent shared a contact history with the man. The fees had been split. The mother was real. The illness had been real, in a mild and manageable way, and the medical costs had been substantially inflated beyond what was actually required. I listened to the voice note a second time. Then I opened the notebook and wrote down the total, $29,000. I wrote it in the same way I'd been recording the visa payments, date, amount, purpose, and then I closed the notebook. I cross-referenced everything the investigator had said against my own timeline. The 2 cold weeks in month 16, she had been managing another situation, and the demand on her attention had been temporarily elsewhere. The second phone, not a school phone. The photographs of the classroom, sourced, presumably, from somewhere online or from someone she knew. The school district discrepancy, not administrative redistricting. Just a small slip, caught and papered over, and I had handed her the paper myself. It all resolved. That's the only word for it. Every item I had filed, every explanation I had accepted, every discrepancy I had redirected, all of it resolved into a single coherent picture. I had all the pieces. I had been in possession of the pieces for some time. I had simply, very carefully, and very deliberately refused to assemble them. I messaged Lynn that evening rather than calling. I chose message deliberately. I wanted a record, and more than that, I did not want to hear her voice while this was happening, because I was not confident of what that would do to me, and I wanted to finish the thing cleanly. I told her I knew about the school. I told her I knew about the apartment in Sutra. I told her I knew about the visa agent. She replied within 3 minutes. She said the investigator had made a mistake, that the school situation was complicated, and she would explain. She said she didn't understand why I didn't trust her. She said her exact words were, "After everything I trusted you." I read that message twice. Then I wrote back, "I know what's true, Lynn. I'm not angry. I just need you to know I know." That was the last message she received from me. She read it. The blue ticks appeared, and then, inside 20 minutes, I was blocked on every platform she had. WhatsApp, Zalo, Facebook, all of them, in quick succession, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long it should take. The speed of it was the thing that stayed with me. Not the deception itself. I had understood the deception before I sent the first message. The speed. 20 minutes to close every door, to make certain there was nothing left open that could be inconvenient later. That was not the improvised reaction of someone caught off guard. That was a procedure. I understood, from the speed, that I had not been the first. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the laptop and booked a flight home. Dublin, 3 days' time, via Doha. I got the last seat in my preferred aisle. I found Willem the following morning and told him the outline of what the investigator had confirmed. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'm sorry, Declan." He said it simply and without elaboration, which was exactly right. I went to Hun's cafe in the afternoon. I sat at my usual table and drank a cup of sa, and looked at the street below for the last time. When I got up to go, I told Hung I was heading home for a while. She asked if everything was all right. I said it was more or less fine, thanks. She nodded in a way that suggested she understood considerably more than I had said, which is the kind of intelligence that comes from running a cafe in a city like this for 20 years. I packed in 40 minutes. That's not a metaphor. It was genuinely 40 minutes. There wasn't much. A suitcase, a backpack, a notebook with some numbers written in it. I took a grab to the airport in the early morning dark. The city went past the window. The river, the bridges lit up in color, the motorbikes already moving at 5 in the morning because they never really stop. And I watched it without the particular grief I'd expected, which is its own kind of information. On the plane, I had a window seat. I looked out for a while after takeoff, but we were into cloud quickly and there was nothing to see. I put the notebook in the seat pocket in front of me. I thought about what I was going to say to nobody in particular when I landed. I didn't have anything yet. But I had the notebook, and I had the numbers, and I had a reasonably clear account of how I had arrived at them, and that, I thought, was probably where you had to start. I landed in Dublin at 6:40 in the morning. The light was the particular gray that Ireland does in autumn, flat and total. The kind that makes everything look like it's been slightly turned down. I came through arrivals with the suitcase and the backpack and the notebook in my jacket pocket, and stood for a moment in the terminal while people moved around me, and I thought, right, here we are then. I didn't ring anyone. There was no one to ring who knew the full shape of what had happened, and I didn't have the language for it yet anyway. I took the train to Limerick, 2.5 hours. The Midlands going past in the window, flat fields and gray skies, and the particular texture of a country that has been there a long time and is not especially interested in your recent experiences. The flat I'd been renting before the last visit had gone. The landlord had let it while I was away, which was his right and which I'd half expected. A colleague from the station knew a bedsit on a street off the Ennis Road, available monthly, €1,200, a single room and a kitchenette and a bathroom with a shower that took 90 seconds to warm up. I took it. I unpacked in 20 minutes. Then I sat in the one chair the room contained and looked at the wall for a while. I want to be careful not to make those 3 months sound more dramatic than they were. I ate. I slept. I walked along the Shannon most mornings, the same river I'd walked for years, and I let it be a river rather than a metaphor. I watched television in the evenings and drank a moderate amount of Jameson and did not answer the phone on most days, which was less a descent into darkness than a simple preference for not having to explain anything to anyone. Alfie rang twice. I told her the relationship had ended and that I was fine. She asked if I wanted company, and I said I didn't, not at the moment. She accepted this with the particular understanding of a daughter who has learned that her father processes things privately and that pressing him is not productive. Nimes sent a message. I replied briefly. I said I was home, I was all right, I'd be in touch properly soon. I didn't have the language for the full story, and I wasn't certain, if I'm honest, that I'd earned the sympathy. There are things you don't tell your daughters because you're protecting them. There are other things you don't tell them because you're protecting yourself. I was doing some of both, and I knew it. The slow work of those months was not the money. The money was real, and the money was gone, and that was a fact that had to be accommodated. But facts can be accommodated. You put them in the account, you adjust, you make peace with a slightly smaller margin than you'd expected. The pension was intact. That was the thing that kept the story from being worse, as I'd been telling myself since the plane. The slow work was something else. It was the recalibration of a man who has to update his model of himself when the model turns out to be wrong. I had believed, for 26 years and then beyond, that I could read people. That belief was not arrogance, or not only arrogance, it was a professional assessment based on a long track record. I was good at it. I had the results. Suspects read, cases built, confessions obtained in rooms where other officers had walked away empty. I had earned the confidence. What I had not understood was that the confidence was calibrated to a specific set of conditions. I could read people who were afraid of me, people who had something at stake in the encounter, who were operating under pressure, who needed to convince me of something. In that context, I was excellent. 26 years, excellent. Lynn was not afraid of me. She had nothing at stake in the encounter in the way I was used to encountering stakes. She was not trying to convince me of a story under pressure. She was constructing conditions in which I would convince myself. That is a completely different operation, and it requires a completely different skill to detect. And I did not have that skill. I had mistaken one for the other for my entire career, and never had cause to know the difference until I did. That understanding arrived over the 3 months in the bedsit, not all at once, but incrementally, the way most honest reckonings arrive. Each morning walk along the Shannon, I had a slightly clearer version of it than the morning before. By the end, I could state it plainly, the way I've just stated it to you, without needing to protect anything. There are other things I understand now that I want to put on record, because they are the only useful thing that came out of this, and it would seem wasteful not to say them. The architecture of reluctance. The woman who seemed not to want to be in a relationship with me was not safer than a woman who did. She was operating a specific and effective technique. Reluctance is not indifference. Reluctance can be manufactured by someone who understands that a man who has been left once will find unavailability more compelling than pursuit, because unavailability feels like choice rather than desperation. I was not being chosen despite the reluctance. I was being chosen by means of it. The financial progression. Each individual payment I made was, in isolation, defensible. The textbook money was $200. The medication was $400. Each amount had a justification, a context, a face behind it that made it feel like a decision rather than a transaction. It is only when you line them up in sequence that the system becomes visible. No one amount crossed the threshold that would have made me stop. All of them together crossed it substantially. That is the design. If you're keeping account of individual payments and assessing each one on its merits, you are not keeping the right account. The cost that isn't money. I kept my daughters at a distance for 18 months because I was managing a story I wasn't ready to share. I missed things during that time, occasions, conversations, the small accumulation of presence that constitutes a relationship. That cost doesn't appear in the notebook, but it's there. And the professional confidence. The thing I was most certain of was the thing that made me most vulnerable, because it made me resistant to doubt. I didn't question my own read of the situation because I trusted my read of situations. By the time I had enough information to question it honestly, I had invested too much to want to. I was protecting the story as much as the relationship. Those are the same mechanism, and I should have known that, and I didn't. I returned to Da Nang 4 months after leaving. I know that sounds strange. It sounds strange to me sometimes, sitting here now. But the city was real. My liking of it was real. The coffee was real, and the river was real, and the particular quality of a morning in this place that I had found and genuinely loved before everything else that was mine. And I wasn't willing to hand it over as well as the money. I have a different guest house now, further from the river, quieter street. I don't go to the cafe near the Han River Market, not from grief, from the same pragmatism that makes a sensible person choose a different route after a road accident. There's nothing to be gained from the original location and several things to be avoided. I have Willem, I have hewing, I have a small number of other people I've come to know over time, carefully, in the way that I should perhaps have known people from the beginning. I am careful now in ways I wasn't before. More specifically, I am careful in the right ways rather than the wrong ones. There is a distinction, and it took $29,000 to understand it. Humility is not something a Garda officer in Limerick gets a lot of practice with. The job does not reward it. The job rewards confidence, certainty, the ability to read a situation quickly and act on your reading. I was well trained for a world in which that was the relevant skill. I am learning, at 54, in a city I found on YouTube at 3 in the morning, to be a slightly different kind of person. It is slow work. I am told it gets easier. I spent nearly 3 decades thinking I could read people. Turns out, I could read people who were afraid of me. She wasn't afraid of me. That's a very different skill set, and I didn't have it. That's Declan's story. I want to say a couple of things before we go, because this channel doesn't just collect these accounts and move on. We try to be useful with them. What happened to Declan is not about Vietnam. It's not about Vietnamese women. The vast majority of people in this country are exactly what they appear to be: decent people living their lives, warm to visitors, not running a long-form financial extraction operation on lonely Westerners. To suggest otherwise would be both wrong and offensive. And it's not what this channel is about. What this is about is a specific and sophisticated form of targeted exploitation that identifies a very particular profile: men who are lonely, who have accessible savings, and who are confident enough in their own judgment to dismiss the warnings they've already been given. That combination makes someone an effective mark. It's not a character flaw. It's a vulnerability that looks, from the inside, exactly like a strength. If you recognize something in what Declan described: the architecture of reluctance, the small calibration payments, the financial escalation that stays just inside the line of plausibility, the way each red flag got a reasonable explanation and got filed away, that recognition is the thing worth paying attention to, not as a reason to distrust everyone, and not as a reason to avoid this part of the world, as a reason to be honest with yourself about what you're looking for and what you might accept in order to find it. Declan's out there now, drinking his coffee, walking his river, being careful in the right ways. That's not nothing. That's actually something. Thanks for watching. Stay curious. Stay honest with yourself. And we'll see you on the next one.